Welcome back, Toro students. I'm Mr. Martinez.
I'm Ms. Garcia.
Mr. Santiago here.
And this is History Talks. Don't remember, History Talks is that opportunity in our world history class where your lectures are pre-recorded into an Edpuzzle video, where once in a while in this video, it will stop and check to make sure that you are actually learning before proceeding forward. There is going to be a small set of notes at the very end highlighting on a few of the different things that you're going to be learning about today's topic. And as you guys can see, we are continuing with our story of World War II. We're now talking about the second stage. We saw how the first one turned out. How does the second stage turn out differently for the Allies in what we're calling the Allies turn the tide? Let's go ahead and take a look at the things we're looking for within today's lessons.
All right, today's history standard is the History Standard 10.8.6. We're going to discuss the human costs of war with particular attention to the civilian and military losses in Russia, Germany, Britain, the United States, China, and Japan. Our essential question for this activity is, what is the costs of nations committing to total war? Let's take a recap of some of the things that we have discussed in this unit. We have the two sides of our war. We have the Allied powers, which constitute the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. They're our new player. We also have the Axis powers, which is Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now let's review some of the things that have occurred in each of those two allies. For the Axis powers, Germany has invaded much of Eastern Europe and has been constantly bombing Britain. Additionally, Hitler breaks the Nazi-Soviet pact and attacks the Soviet Union. In Japan, they launched an attack on the United States, bombing a military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japan also begins invasions throughout the Pacific, taking control of several new territories. Now, for the Allied powers, in France, they have been seized by the Germans. Britain is maintaining its ground, and morale continues to rise as small progress is made against the German aggressions. In response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war after a long policy of isolationism. The Soviet Union works in collaboration with the Allied powers after Hitler breaks the Nazi-Soviet pact. Neither the Allied powers or the Soviets trust each other. Again, we have a quick recap of our key players, the Axis powers versus the Allied powers. But we do have some characters we want to readdress. We have Stalin. Now, before, you'll remember he was a part of the Axis powers during the Nazi-Soviet pact, but after Hitler double crosses him, he joins in cahoots, basically, with the Allied powers. Now, we also have a new player here in the middle of that picture. You'll notice that it is President Truman of the United States. Unfortunately, our previous president, Roosevelt, died. So Truman takes over. We also have Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain. And then we also just want to readdress who our key players are in Japan. We have Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan, and we have Suzuki, the Prime Minister of Japan. And one more time, just to take a look about what it is that we're going to be doing and the course of our events. We start with the United States declaring war on the Axis powers, beginning with the United States and Britain committing to a total war. We have the Battle of Midway in the Pacific, the Normandy landing in June of 1944, and the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. We have Soviets attacking from the east, the battles of Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, and then eventually the end with the Axis powers surrender of World War II.
So ladies and gentlemen, let's start today's lesson with what total war is, or what our topic is right now, total commitment to war. Now that we've seen Hitler take full control of Europe, how are the Allies going to commit to trying to win at this moment where they seem like they're the losers? How are they going to turn it around and rechange that focus? Well, with the Axis powers taking so much gains in territory in Europe and even the Pacific, the Allied powers do actually make some big changes finally. They rechange their societies so that they help them succeed within the war. And that's exactly what total war is. Total war just means that you're totally committed to the war focus. You're committed to trying to make sure that your team is going to win. So how do these countries actually do that? What does the United States and Great Britain do to be able to change up this so that they can be more successful? Well, it's all about economics and resources, right? Factories stopped making public goods and started making war goods. So in societies that maybe factories were making cars and clothes and basic, public goods, they were told by the government, instead of making that car, could you make us a tank? Could you make us a bullet? And you start to see lots of different jobs and factories back at home changing, making weapons and resources for the war. Not only are they going to be making stuff, but they're going to be on a budget. And we're talking rationing. Rationing is essentially when you're being told to limit how much stuff you consume. So they start to ration items like food, tin, rubber, gasoline, you name it, anything that is in the name for war, we are now going to not consume it for our personal self-interest and instead make sure the government has it for their military. So now you're going to be given a ration card that says you can only have 2 gallons of milk this week and no more than that. So citizens start to have to budget the way that they live their lives back at home. Not only by living, but how they earn money too. You're going to start to see a big shift in society. While most of the males will be off into war, women are going to be a huge support within the home front, as now they're given the opportunity to leave the homestead and to get into factories and more industry where they're now able to be a part of the working force. Okay. Another thing is war bonds, which is essentially the government asking you to give them your money in exchange. They'll pay you back after the war. So lots of big changes in the name of trying to win World War II for the Allied powers.
A total commitment to war. Okay, so we have a checkpoint here. What changes did Britain and the United States make in order to win the war? One more time, guys. What changes did Britain and the United States make in order to win the war?
Perfect. Thank you so much for responding to that. Let's continue.
So we want to take a look at the war progress. We are now fighting a war on 3 different fronts. 1, 2, 3. The war is beginning to be fought on 3 fronts, specifically North Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Pacific. The Japanese military and the US military are colliding in the Pacific. You can see on the map here how we have a majority of the Southern Pacific islands. You'll see that all in the yellow is the territories that have been taken over by the Japanese during the Axis powers aggressions. You'll notice that the green arrows are the movements of the Allied powers, or primarily the Americans and the British, who are trying to take territory back. Everywhere that you see a little flash sign is where a major battle has occurred between these 2 different people, okay? They're almost exclusively fought by plane and by ships. Now, for some instances, they are fighting hand-to-hand on these islands, but for the most part, they're fighting by air and by ships bombarding each other on these small islands. A significant battle is the Battle of the Coral Sea. It is at this point that Japan could no longer advance against the US naval fleet. Up until this point, they had almost absolutely no resistance. All of the yellow is what they were able to take until the Americans and the British began to fight against them once they entered into the war. Another important event is the Battle at Midway in 1942, and Japan suffers a huge loss as the United States destroys 4 ships and 250 of their planes. After the Battle of Midway, Japan is unable to lead any more offensive attacks after their loss. So this is significant because we know that even though that they have gained all of this territory in the Pacific, after the Battle of Midway, they can no longer expand. Progress does continue. The United States and Britain did not like to trust the Soviet Union and vice versa. Remember, just a few months ago, they were enemies and now they're working together. However, they needed each other in order to defeat the Axis powers. They needed each other in order to defeat Japan and Germany. The US and Britain agreed to allow Stalin to keep the territories that he gained under the Nazi-Soviet pact. So they make a deal and now they're willing to work with each other. Once again, the Germans invade the Soviet Union. This time they're focusing their attention on Stalingrad. So in the beginning, in our previous chats, we noticed that they were attacking Leningrad. Leningrad is northern Russia, and now they are attacking in southern Russia. Hitler and Stalin put all of their resources into fighting each other because just as much as Stalin doesn't like the Americans, he really doesn't like the Germans. Both sides are suffering huge casualties. Large numbers of their soldiers are dying during these battles. The Soviets were able to surround the Germans who were lacking resources, and eventually the Germans will surrender because if it's anything that the Soviets can do, it is survive. They have a huge population, and we will talk more about that later.
Hey, checkpoint. How effective are Germany and Japan's advancements? Again, how effective are Germany and Japan's advancements?
Perfect. Thank you so much for responding to that, folks. We're seeing lots of big changes in the Pacific. Let's go ahead and continue our lesson. So, not only are there some big changes happening in the Pacific, but in Europe, since the last time we've talked, there is some new moves going on. The last time we talked, we saw the Allied powers leaving Europe after the rescue of Dunkirk, and they're now trying to figure out how do we get back on mainland Europe? How do we try to make gains against Hitler in taking back France and all this new territory he won? There's lots of different things that happen, and there's so many different things we could talk about, but here's just a few, okay? First off, Normandy landing, or D-Day, is perhaps one of the most infamous dates that we have within World War II, as this was the time that the Allied powers tried to invade France and take it away from Hitler. Allied powers will cross the English Channel and storm the beaches in Normandy, France. As you guys can see from that top picture where those arrows are all pointing, that is the landing point for the Allies who are trying to strike back at Hitler. By August of 1944, Allied troops reach Paris and Germany begins to retreat from France. Even though that might sound like it quickly happened, it didn't. There was so many things that happened in between, but you will see that the Allies will slowly get more power and control in France and pushing the Nazis further back to their own country. A couple of other notable events is the Battle of the Bulge, another infamous one in December of 1944. This was another key moment when the Germans were starting to slip up a lot within their defenses of trying to control Europe. You start to see a lot of different methods used. Constant air bombings by the Allies had devastated the German military bases, factories, railroads, and oil depots and cities. So the Allied powers were starting to ruin the network system Germany had that was supporting their new regime in taking over other territories. And without supplies and reinforcements, they start to lose more ground. Why is this happening? What happened to the Nazis' confidence? Well, it frankly comes down to focus. When you're battling on multiple different fronts, you don't do a really good job doing a good military tactic of winning. Allied troops were attacking Germany from the west, And the Soviets were now pushing the Nazis back out of their country, back through Poland, and even getting closer to their home. So they're being squeezed. And Germany is running out of options before it's too late for them to do anything about it. All of this is, of course, at the expense of human lives, not only the Germans, but of course the Allied powers, and like Ms. Garcia noted, the Soviets, who will lose many people in this battle. Let's go ahead and see what that could possibly look like on actual D-Day at Normandy with this quick video. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for going through that video with us and showing off a little bit of what are the things we're talking about and seeing it in action.
Okay, sounds good. Checkpoint. How did the Normandy landing and the Battle of the Bulge change the direction of the war? Again, guys, how did the Normandy landing and the Battle of the Bulge change the direction of the war?
Go ahead and respond to that to be able to continue with today's lesson. Perfect. Thank you. Let's go ahead and continue the show with our next topic.
We will continue the show with our next topic, end of the war in Europe. Guys, we've made it. It's the end of the war. The Yalta Conference in February of 1945. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meet to discuss the end of the war. Stalin wants to maintain control in Eastern European nations as a buffer. Remember, Stalin doesn't get along with anybody, really, and he wants to maintain those territories that surround him in order to keep everybody else out of Russia and Russia's business. Churchill and Roosevelt fear the spread of communism under the control of Stalin. So while it's a buffer for Stalin, it's also a buffer for the rest of the United States and the United Kingdom. By April 30th, Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker rather than be caught by the Allied or Soviet forces. Not long after, on May 8th of 1945, Germany surrendered and the war was over. So from our previous slides, we know just how devastating some of those battles were for the German army. And eventually they knew that both the United States and the Soviets were closing in around German territories. Hitler would rather take his own life. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker rather than being caught by the Allied or Soviet forces. Not long after, on May 8th of 1945, Germany surrendered and the war was over. From our previous slide, we can understand how devastating those losses were for Germany. Rather than be captured, Hitler chose to take his own life, and that is how the war comes to an end in Europe. We have the division of post-war Germany. Germany is split up into 4 occupied zones, with each country taking a little piece. You have the Americans, the French, the British, and the Soviet forces, and they all take a little piece of Germany. The Allied powers still need Soviet support to defeat Japan in the Pacific, so they maintain their alliance as well. Stalin promised to declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender and new territories in the Pacific. They still do not trust each other. They are frenemies. We just want to make that clear, because them working together right now, a little bit of foreshadowing, does not mean that they are going to be getting along after the war either.
Ms. Garcia, real quick, you said the war is over. So all of World War II is over right now? It's over?
No, we still have a very important topic to cover, but we're going to cover that in a new unit starting next week.
Okay.
Quick checkpoint, guys. How did the war end for Germany? So how did the war end for Germany?
Perfect. Thank you so much for responding. Let's go ahead and see how the battles continue in the Pacific. Yes, the war's over in Europe, but this is a world war, not Europe war, which means that this thing is still ongoing with one other enemy still out there, Japan. Yes, we see Japan is struggling in the Pacific now that the Allied powers is at full force, but they're not giving up. They're not calling it quits so quickly. A couple of things happening with the Pacific that we're going to talk about. The Bataan Death March is another infamous event that happens. Essentially, Japan launches a series of bombings in the Philippines, which is a territory of the United States since 1898. And it keeps attacking with whatever resources they can. In 1942, Japan occupies the Philippines and they surrender. The Japanese force their prisoners to march more than 60 miles in incredible heat with almost no water or food. So when the Japanese take over the Philippines, the prisoners of war, the Allied powers, the US troops or whoever, are now under the imprisonment of the Japanese. And the Japanese do these death marches to try to get rid of their prisoners, because why take care of them when you're busy with a war? And you're going to see that this is going to result to the death of 10,000 prisoners within their watch. Another thing that becomes a big development within the Pacific is something called island hopping. This is what made the Allied powers successful in taking back all the land the Japanese took. The United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, and the goal of the campaign was to recapture some of the Japanese-held islands, capturing islands one by one. Each time they would launch an invasion, clear out the island, claim that they conquered it, and then move on to the next one until they feel that they have continued getting rid of the Japanese advancement. American forces are led by a General Douglas MacArthur, who was a really big person within the operations of island hopping. By the mid-1945, most of the Japanese Navy and Air Force had been destroyed. However, those Japanese governments do not want to quit. They reject any form of surrendering or negotiating to end the war. Instead, they double down on their efforts. They start doing new methods of brutal tactics to scare the Americans into more war. Things like kamikaze and suicide bombings. Essentially, kamikazes is when a person takes a plane and drives it into the enemy's ship or location. So we're starting to see some big changes happen within the Pacific with this new desperate tactics that the Japanese are using. Another few things we'll note is the Battle of Iwo Jima, very famous. That's that classic photo you see of the Americans holding up the US flag on top of a mountain. That was a very optimal moment in our advance in the Pacifics as we start to take even more grounds from the Japanese, being even a turning point where the Japanese feel like they cannot regain after losing Iwo Jima, especially with the placement of Iwo Jima being really close to Japan, allowing Allied powers to eventually bomb the mainland of Japan finally. The Battle of Okinawa is another moment that we like to refer to. This is another advance that we start to see. The US captured another island just a short distance away from Japan. This is scaring a lot of the Japanese as they're starting to see the war becoming a lot closer to home, leading to more desperate methods.
Quick checkpoint, guys. Describe the military actions of Japan and United States in the Pacific. One more time, you're going to describe the military actions of Japan and United States in the Pacific.
So we discussed previously how the war and the battles come to an end in Europe. Let's discuss how the war ends in the Pacific. We have Japanese resistance. As Mr. Martinez alluded to earlier, the Japanese do not want to surrender, regardless of their defeats in the Pacific and regardless of recommendations for them to surrender, they refuse. During and after the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, many Japanese began to commit harakiri or seppuku. It's a form of ritual suicide that originated with Japan's ancient samurai warrior class. This is important because we need to understand how the Japanese people feel about defeat. The Japanese civilians, especially women, feared what would happen if captured by the Americans. Japanese soldiers preferred this death rather than capture by Americans. American forces had captured Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and had devastated Japanese industries and cities thus far. We also have the introduction of a new idea, which is the American nuclear tests. Unknown to the Japanese, the United States had a secret Manhattan Project, and they had detonated an atomic bomb test in New Mexico in the United States on July 17th of 1945. In the Potsdam Declaration of July 26 of 1945, the Allies were demanding the unconditional surrender of all of the Japanese armed forces. In Japan, we have the Prime Minister, Kentaro Suzuki, and he supported telling the press that his government was paying no attention to the Allied ultimatum. Japan was now at a disadvantage militarily, and they had suffered huge casualties as a loss of territory. They had a lack of resources, which caused growing civil discontent. The people were tired of war, tired of fighting, and tired of the restrictions, tired of everything that was happening because of the war. To the Japanese, however, suffering would be a disgrace and a humiliation. However, the Japanese military understood that they could not defend a war on two fronts, both in the against the United States and the Soviet Union. They were dependent upon the idea of the neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. So although Japan really did not want to surrender and they were not accepting any surrender terms, the government and the military knew that they essentially had lost the war and didn't have anywhere to progress. They were really depending and waiting for Soviet action to decide what their next step would be. This is significant because Japan is on the brink of invasion from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Japan is very anti-communist, and they already rejected the terms of surrender, and it is unclear what they will do next. I don't think that they knew exactly what they were going to do next.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what happens. In the meanwhile, while they are deciding their next move, we have the atomic bombs that are used in the Pacific. In Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945, 11 days after the Japanese rejection of the Potsdam Declaration, President Truman gives the order to drop an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 80,000 people and fatally wounding thousands more. The Japanese War Council met to discuss their options. Around half favored surrendering to the Allied powers. The other half wanted to wait for confirmation that it was an actual use of an atomic weapon. Remember, boys and girls, at this time, they don't have the same technology for communication that we do. They also don't really know what the Americans are doing and that they have these atomic testing. So they don't know, is it just a regular bomb? Is it an atomic bomb? They don't know. The Soviets declare war against them on August 8th, just 2 days after they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. The Soviets declared war on the Japanese and invaded Manchuria, China. And although it is China that they are invading, it is a territory that is currently being occupied by the Japanese. This breaks their neutrality pact, and it definitely concerns the Japanese because that was the one thing that they were really hoping would not happen. They already knew that fighting a front with the United States was going to make them suffer, but fighting the United States and the Soviet Union at the same time, much like what happened in Germany, was not a good military place for them to be at. 1 day later, the United States drops a bomb in Nagasaki on August 8th of 1945. This, again, is only 3 days after they bombed Hiroshima and only a few hours after the Soviets invade Manchuria.
Wow. So a lot of big moves happening for Japan that are not in their favor. Let's take a look to see what the atomic bombing would look like on Japan during that time. Thank you guys so much for watching that video. As you guys can see, this is a huge moment in human history. We've never seen such a bomb like this, and we definitely don't know what this does to people when it does go off. So this is a big moment for human history with the devastation that humans are now capable of.
What an ending. Wow. Checkpoint. Describe the events leading up to the end of World War II. Again, you're going to describe the events leading up to the end of World War II.
Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. So let's talk the aftermath. After World War II, what does the world look like? There is so much that happens to the world. Let's go ahead and take a look. Let's start with casualties. Casualties. The war had killed as many as 50 million people around the world. In Europe alone, over 30 million had lost their lives, more than half of them being civilians. So we're talking soldiers, civilians, everyone involved. We have to acknowledge the Soviets took the worst when it came to casualties. They suffered the most, with over 20 million people dying in their own country. It's difficult, honestly, to calculate what the exact numbers are, just because there's just so much records and not everyone's within the military, and it is difficult to us to get a true record of what that looks like. But we do know what the physical destruction looks like. After World War II is over, after the dust is settled, you start to see Germany, France, England, Poland, and the Soviet Union, Japan, and China being completely wrecked. It is unrecognizable. The residential, the buildings, the cities, the factories, everything is demolished, and it is as if they have to start all over. Roads, railroads, the infrastructure, everything is destroyed. Millions of people are displaced and become refugees during this time. And talking about people suffering, there is a lot of economic cost to this war too. Europe overall, damage caused by the bombing was the most significant in Poland and Germany, with about 30% of their buildings destroyed. The economies in these countries were devastated, and it would take them years to build back up to something that was similar to what they were before World War II. Asia also had a bad experience with their aftermath. The vast majority of the invaded countries had their economies and resources commandeered by the Japanese, and Japan also suffered with 40% of their buildings being destroyed by Allied bombings, including those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So both the land the Japanese took and the island of Japan was also devastated after this. If you guys look at our charts, here are some numbers that show off a little bit of the comparisons between a couple of these different countries and their end results. As you can clearly see, the Soviet Union gets first place for least having fun during World War II. They suffered incredibly during this war. When it comes to wartime spending, you can also see how much money was invested in this war per country. There is another thing that does happen in the aftermath of World War II, and that's the United Nations. The United Nations finally is a coalition of nations to keep peace in the hopes of trying to stop another world war. They were once called the League of Nations, but now there's this new nation club where now they are trying to take seriously the idea of communicating and collaborating with one another before we get to another global conflict like this. The United Nations is still around, and there's a couple of different rules and systems up to it on how it operates, but it still has a foothold within our global stage.
All right, a quick checkpoint, guys. We want you to describe the damage caused by World War II. Describe the damage caused by World War II.
Thank you so much for responding. If you said there was a lot, you were right.
So last thing that we're going to do is we're going to collaboratively work together to demonstrate our understanding, and we're going to do that on a discussion board. But before we get to the discussion board, we're going to cover some ideas and we're going to collaboratively kind of identify what some of these things mean. The question for the discussion board is, in your opinion, what was the cost, physical, financial, moral, of the nations committing to total war? In just a second, we're going to identify what do those things mean and what examples can we find within our lecture today.
Perfect. And once you guys go ahead and do that discussion board, you are then officially done with your history talk. Congratulations, you finished World War II. Kinda. That's right. We have a special topic that needs recognition within this whole story, and that's going to be our last piece with World War II. But until then, folks, thank you so much for participating in this, and please make sure you do turn in this assignment properly under Google Classroom to get your grade. Thank you, folks, for being here. I'm Mr. Martinez.
I'm Ms. Garcia.
Mr. Santiago.
And that's enough for today. Thank you so much, and have a good day.